Good afternoon, everyone. When we planned this talk, I was provost. Now I'm acting Chancellor Ralph Hexter. No wonder I'm out of breath. Whatever the title, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the fourth event in the 2015-16 season of the Provost Forums on the Public University and the Public Good. Today we're privileged to have as our lecturer Professor Estela Bensimon of the University of Southern California. Before we introduce her, I have some quick announcements. First, I want to express my gratitude to all who have made this event possible. In particular, I want to thank the Provost Forum Steering Committee, led by Martin Kenny, Professor of Human and Community Development, and Cristina Gonzalez, Professor of Spanish and Education, and also a member of our steering committee who's serving as moderator of our event today. My gratitude also to the 3 campus units that have joined the Office of the Provost to co-sponsor this lecture: the Community and Regional Development Program, the School of Education, the Chicano and Chicano Studies Program, and the Center for Regional Change. And I note that's 4, so clearly I can't count. Looking ahead, I urge you to mark your calendars for our final event of the season. On May 25th from 3 to 5 p.m., Professor Gonzalez, who's moderating today's forum, and Dr. Liliana Pedraja of the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile will speak on the topic, Privatization and Access, the Chilean higher education experiment and its discontents. The forum will again be held in this room with a reception to follow. So far this season, we've heard lectures by Julie Freischlag and Glenn Olds on universities, hospitals, and the social mission, by Christopher Newfield on the great mistake, how private sector models damage public universities and how they can recover, and by Christopher Kelty on open access piracy and the scholarly publishing market. For those of you who are unable to see these or any earlier forums, you haven't missed out. Our Provost Forum's website has information about all upcoming events as well as videos of all past events. I encourage you to visit the site at provostforums.ucdavis.edu. Finally, there will be a question and answer period after Professor Bensimon's lecture, and then a reception right out here. So you're all invited to stay after the talk for refreshments. Before I yield the podium to Professor Gonzalez, who will properly introduce our speaker, I will take the opportunity to offer a brief pre-introductory comment. In the published abstract for her lecture, Professor Bensimon refers with apparent optimism to, and I quote, a strong and comprehensive line of research that documents empirically the educational benefits of diversity, end quote. And yet she also acknowledges that the existence of this research has not yet enabled us to triumph over what she calls, and again I quote, the intractable nature of racial inequality in higher education. As discouraging as this statement is, it hardly seems surprising. Those in this room are all too aware of the disappointingly slow progress of our efforts to create a fully equitable campus community. But I'm given to wonder, shouldn't we feel surprised by our deficient success? Isn't equity a fairly straightforward idea? Isn't it a goal that, after many years and a great deal of effort, we should be pretty good at pursuing? Asking such questions is enough to shake our Enlightenment faith in the power of empirical truth, reason, and dialogue to move us in the right direction, which is also to say, it's enough to shake our faith in higher education's power to do good. And yet I believe our current struggling with respect to equity is due in large part to the fact that the very subject of our investigations has been evolving, becoming exponentially more inclusive. In recent years especially, we've become increasingly aware that the issue of equity is, to a meaningful degree, at play in many more places than we thought before, and at many more levels. Indeed, we now recognize it to be a valid concern even in the most hidden corners of our everyday behavior. And if this weren't challenging enough, we cannot be confident that even now we see the equity landscape completely or clearly. So we are grateful to Professor Bensimon for joining us today to do 2 things. First, to help us in our continuing quest to emerge from ignorance into light, and second, to discuss how we make that all-important transition from seeing the light to embracing it and benefiting from its wisdom. And now, Professor Gonzalez.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Cristina Gonzalez. As the Provost Chancellor has said, I'm in the Spanish department and in the School of Education. In the last 15 or 20 years, I have devoted much of my time to study higher education in two different fields. One is academic leadership and the other is diversity matters. So it is a very great treat for me to have Professor Bensimon here today, because those two areas happen to be the things that she does. And she does extraordinarily well. She's a very distinguished scholar. As you know, she's a professor at the University of Southern California. She's in the School of Education there. And she's also co-director of the Center for Urban Education. She has a BA and an MA from Montclair State University in New Jersey, and her doctoral degree is from Columbia. Before coming to California, she was a faculty member at Penn State. In addition to these faculty activities, she has done a considerable amount of administration, and I want to say something about this because I think it's relevant. If you look at her resume, you are going to see a number of different things that you can group into two big groups. One, I will say, I will describe as perhaps student affairs kind of things, her involvement in academic counseling or transfer programs from community colleges to universities. So these are things that have to do with access, with students, with diversity, with equity. And then other activities that she's engaged in are typical academic leadership positions, like being an associate dean or even being assistant to the president at a different university. So these are two sets of activities, and when you look at her long list of publications, and it is really long, many books and articles there, you will see those two groupings there too. She has a very large and important body of work about academic leadership, and very comprehensive also, because she talks about all kinds of things, from department chairs to college presidents, from all different perspectives. It's important work. She's well known for it. But she's even better known for the work she has done in the area of diversity, equity, access. Her equity scorecard has become something very well known, and this is a tool to assess diversity in institutions, but it is more than a tool. It is really a process by which researchers, practitioners become researchers and discover new knowledge, and then they use that new knowledge to inform their practice. So you can see how practice and research feed each other, support each other. They are not in conflict with each other. I think this is very important work and very exciting work, and I'm very much looking forward to her presentation. Please welcome Dr. Bensimon.
Thank you, Christina. I think you memorized my my CV. Thank you very much. I think you know it better than I do, and I really like that grouping of my work. Also, thank you to the Acting Chancellor, Ralph Hexter, for your introduction, and thank you to all of you who made the time to come and share with me the Provost lecture. And I just disconnected my computer, I think. Let's see. Sorry about that. There. Okay. I must admit that coming from a private university, USC, I struggled a bit in how to frame my talk. In line with the work of Brian Pusser, who is at the, oops, what happened there? All right, let's see. Okay, so let me just go here. Okay, so in line with the work of Brian Pusser and others, including Professor Cristina Gonzalez's outstanding book on the University of California, I view USC, and in fact all of higher education institutions, as potential sites for public and critical discourse and the creation and transmission of knowledge for the social good. To frame my talk and its relationship to the purpose of the Provost Forums, I want to reiterate their purpose, as stated in the materials I received when I was invited to give this lecture. The purpose of the Provost Forums on the public university and the social good is to discuss serious challenges facing the public university and ways of responding to those challenges. The ultimate goal is to help to produce a public university that will best serve society and individuals. The message that I hope to communicate in my talk this afternoon is that equity is one of the most serious challenges facing higher education. Some would argue that equity is the unpaid debt that our educational system owes to communities of color who have been systematically denied the rights to high-quality educational opportunity. The recent article and editorial in the New York Times on Georgetown University's use of profits from the sale of slaves to support the university during hard times is but one piece of evidence about the magnitude of the debt. The attainment of equity, whether it's at the University of California, the University of Missouri, the University of Wisconsin at Madison, Georgetown University, USC, or the Cal State University system, or the California Community College system, requires that leaders, as well as faculty members, stop viewing the gap in educational outcomes for Blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans as a natural disaster that is lamentable but inevitable. We need to learn to view the persistence of inequity in higher education as a problem that we ourselves create through practices and structures that are not critically race and color conscious. Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, suggests that we academics resist being self-reflective about our professional practices, and to a considerable extent, this may be one of the reasons why, despite the hopes and ambitions of the civil rights movement and legislation, we still have so much further to go. Surveys show that faculty, for the most part, have not made changes in teaching approaches, course content, and topics of discussion despite increased diversity. In one survey that I looked at, slightly less than 1/3 of faculty respondents said that the presence of racially diverse students led them to adjust their course syllabus. More than 50 years have passed since President Lyndon Johnson's iconic 1965 commencement address at Howard University, in which he declared, "We seek not just freedom but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result." He was speaking, of course, of the Civil Rights Act. Yes, higher education is much more diverse today than it was 50 years ago, but we are hardly close to reaching equality as a fact and equality as a result. An alarming aspect of Trump's bid for the presidency is the open now and accepted expression of racism and ethnocentrism. We're not only far from becoming a more equitable society, but sometimes we seem to be going backwards. How problems are framed shape the solutions we develop. In the late 1960s and 1970s, we focused on increased access to higher education as a civil right, and we created a variety of compensatory programs to support the academic and social integration of Black and Latino students, as well as Native American students. Programs like TRIO, EOP, Upward Bound, Puente, Mesa sprouted on just about every campus, and they live on to this day. I didn't look at whether you have any of those programs here, but I'm sure that you do. These programs focus mostly on remediating students to help them adapt to the white culture of higher education institutions. These programs, which often have been a place of solace, often staffed by individuals who strongly identify with the students they serve, have not made their way into the dominant culture of institutions of higher education. These minority-serving programs are repositories of knowledge and practices that work well with students from marginalized communities. But because these programs and the staff, like the students they serve, labor at the margins of institutions, and their leaders often lack formal power, they have not influenced the dominant curriculum pedagogy. Just to show you what I mean, here's a slide that depicts elements of a syllabus of a young faculty member who teaches in the Puente program at a community college, where 90% of the students are Black and Latinos. As you can see, the syllabus, I hope you can see, has all markers that convey the instructor's love, commitment, and caring for her students. Everything about the syllabus, I expect, creates a feeling to students that I want to be in that class. The quote from Bell Hooks up at the top makes clear that the instructor is race conscious. The tone of the syllabus is conversational. It conveys a respect for students. It even tells students about growth mindset, the research of Carol Dweck at Stanford University, as a means, I imagine, of offsetting stereotype threats that impact the performance of students from minoritized groups. Now let's look at this next syllabus. This syllabus is also from the same college, the same department, but a different instructor. This syllabus oozes with rules of every kind. In not so subtle ways, the tone paints an image of an instructor who anticipates only the worst from students and bombards them with rules. I was particularly struck with the gender tone of the examples of what not to do. Don't put makeup on, don't do each other's hairs, and so on. So I hope you can see some of it. The red marks all the rules. I have seen syllabi from the Puente program in many other colleges, which are just as creative as this one. But unfortunately, they have not earned the coveted designation of best practice. And as a consequence, most of the syllabi in developmental math and English courses in community colleges are far more like the rules-minded syllabus than the dynamic one from the Puente instructor. After the Bakke versus UC Davis case, higher education turned its attention to diversity. The ascendancy of the diversity agenda in higher education owes much to Justice Powell's middle-of-the-road opinion, in which he put forth the diversity rationale as the justification for the use of race in admissions. The diversity rationale replaced the reparations rationale for the use of race in admissions, and starting in the 1980s to today, the diversity agenda has largely supplanted the civil rights agenda of racial and ethnic equity in higher education. From a practical political perspective, I understand the purposes served by the diversity rationale. But from a democratic and social justice perspective, the ascendancy of the diversity agenda got me worried, particularly around 1995 when I moved to USC from Penn State. I sensed that diversity, particularly diversity light, which focused on human relations, was casting aside the more challenging project of closing the equity gaps in educational outcomes for the same students who actually were the representation of diversity. In important ways, the diversity agenda has had drawbacks. For example, the civil rights agenda was strictly about reparations for past social injustices, first for blacks, and then added to that, the list were women, Latinos, Native Americans, Asians, Pacific Islanders. Once the diversity agenda took over, it quickly evolved into a laundry list of differences. The biggest problem with the liberal view of diversity is that race, which is and should be treated as an independent source of disadvantage, is now treated as interchangeable with low income, veteran status, foster youth, and sexual orientation. I'm referring here to the California Community College's student equity funds, which, even though they're called the student equity funds, it essentially includes just about everyone can qualify as being an equity beneficiary. I recognize the values that diversity offers and that there is a place for diversity goals, but in my work with colleges nationwide and with foundations, I have seen firsthand that the discourse of diversity makes it easier to avoid to talk about race. Diversity has also given a rationale to those who would rather focus on socioeconomic status and find it more comfortable to measure equity by focusing on Pell recipients. This is particularly true among policymakers and elected office holders. The rationale that racial diversity should be pursued because it is an educational asset that benefits all students has led to flawed reasoning, or to be more gentle, reasoning that is based on a misunderstanding or simplification of diversity. For example, a few months ago, during the arguments related to Fisher versus the University of Texas, Justice Roberts asked, why does diversity matter in the physics class? In other words, why would diversity be a compelling interest for physics? In response to that question, a group of over 100 physicists wrote a letter in which they said, and I quote, "The implication that physics or hard sciences are somehow divorced from the social realities of racism in our society is completely fallacious. The purpose of seeking out talented and otherwise overlooked minority students to fill the physics classrooms is to offset the institutionalized imbalance of power and preference that has traditionally gone and continues to go towards white students. Minority students," they went on, "in a classroom are not there to be at the service of enhancing the experience of white students." Justice Roberts' question expressed one of the fears I had back in 1995, a fear about the potential of the diversity rationale to derail the equity project intended by the civil rights movement. It was my concern that the diversity agenda was blinding us to the great racial gaps in educational outcomes that led me 16 years ago to create the Center for Urban Education, with a research agenda that had 3 goals. The first one was a focus on equity as an institutional responsibility toward Black and Latino students. The second goal was a focus on remediating institutional structures and practices to be more accountable for equity in educational outcomes for Blacks and Latinos. And third, a focus on research as a practice that creates the conditions for equity-minded self-change among practitioners. You'll notice that I say Blacks and Latinos, and I don't say always Native Americans or other marginalized groups. And the reason why I do that is because I'm trying to be consistent with the experience of my center, which has primarily been work with African American and Latino students, or institutions that are predominantly have issues related to Black and Latino students. This agenda is different from the diversity agenda in that it focused specifically in racial equity, not on socioeconomic status and not on gender. And that's not to say that I don't care about gender. In fact, I do have works, several works that are based on feminist theories. But in this work, I don't focus on gender. Racial equity is posited as a matter of institutional and public accountability rather than as a nice thing to have. And it is supported by research methods that serve the traditional purpose of systematic data collection to describe phenomena, but at the same time, the research methods that we use at the Center for Urban Education serve as tools to engage practitioners in a structured, assisted, and equity-focused examination of their institutions and their own practices. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. To carry out this equity agenda, I established CUE, Center for Urban Education, around 1999. It was my great fortune that the work I was proposing coincided and was responsive to USC's aspirations as a university engaged in the solution of social problems of cities experiencing an increased influx of immigrants, increased segregation, and increased inequality. At that time, our provost was Lloyd Armstrong, and he created a special competitive fund to stimulate doing the social good. I don't think he called it that, but I think I can describe it that way. I was lucky to receive almost $1 million, an amount that was as surprising to me as I am sure it was to many others who competed for the funds and were less fortunate. That seed money enabled me to pursue the 3 goals that I have outlined here. I am even luckier that in the subsequent years and continuing to today, our center has been able to grow and attract support from private foundations, as I show here. These are all the foundations that are our partners in our center. Since the founding of CUE, we have partnered to critically engage the equity question in higher education with institutions and systems of higher education in several states: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, California, Nevada, Colorado, also Indiana. It is probably difficult for you to see the entire list, but as you can see, we have worked with many institutions and also the entire University of Wisconsin system and the entire Pennsylvania state system of higher education. To provide the context for the work that we do with all of these institutions and the rationale for the methods that we use, I want to share an excerpt from an interview with a professor in the biological sciences. I conducted this interview a few years ago as part of a grant from the National Science Foundation where we were studying Hispanic serving institutions that were high producers of Hispanic STEM degrees. And our hypothesis was that these institutions probably had faculty members that were what we called institutional agents, meaning that they used their own social and academic capital, their networks, their knowledge on behalf of others who needed them. And so what I'm going to share with you is an excerpt from one of those interviews, which will illustrate the ways in why we do the kind of work that we do. So, So Professor John Professor John has earned his degrees from top research universities, and he comes from a family of college and educated parents. He now teaches at a university that has great ambitions to become a more selective research university, and at the same time has a very high proportion of first-generation low-income Mexican-American students. Professor John is well aware that his background and experiences are different from the experiences of the Mexican-American students in his classes, many of whom are not being successful. He recognizes that unlike him and his friends, the parents of these students do not have the resources to pay for college or graduate school, that the kinds of things that these students worry about are not the kinds of things he ever had to think about. So in talking about the high rates of failure among Mexican-American students in his class, he says they, the students, they don't have much by way of educational background. They don't really know what college is like. They think that college is an extension of high school. They don't really realize how much work they have to put in. Speaking about the students' ability to understand the material in a textbook, he says, they don't understand that you can try to synthesize and you can try to concentrate on a couple of points to get through the real questions that are going to come to you on an exam. After hearing all the reasons that stand in the way of his Latino students' success, I asked him kind of desperately, how do you help them? How do you help them then? That's me. And I am surprised by his response. He says, that's a really interesting question, which sort of sounds as if I had asked something that no one asks, and that he had not thought much about it. After a brief pause, he says, the way that we have been trying to do it is simply by telling them that what they're doing is not right, and telling them, you know, this is the way you should be doing it. And he goes on, I don't think we really have the time to try to think of more effective ways that there might be to help them change their habits, meaning the Mexican-American students. And then he goes on to say, you know that dumb joke about, well, you know, the psychologist can change the light bulb, but the light bulb has to want to change, meaning the Mexican-American students. You know, I can sit there telling them over and over again that they need to approach things differently. And then in a resigned voice, he says, but I think they mostly go back to what they already know. So up to this point in the conversation, Professor John explains the difficulties of Mexican Americans as having to do with the students' bad habits. He also talks about not having the time to think of more effective ways to support them. And he also mentions by the time the students get to his class or college, it may be too late to change. But then suddenly, the interview takes a reflective turn. And Professor John begins to talk about his students' situation in view of a life of accumulated disadvantages and lack of power. Here's what he says. I think, he says, this comes from being minority in the sense of being unempowered, that they're really scared of the professors. You know, I teach classes that have 150 to 200 students. I will only get 6 or 10 that actually come to see me during office hours. The rest of them just stay away. And then he says, I am not sure exactly what it is, but I think there is a part where if you spend your whole life being on the downside of things, you don't expect a lot. You don't think that people owe you much. You get to college, and instead of saying, well, I am owed a good explanation of this material, and if I didn't get it in the lecture, I am going to go see the professor and get the explanation. These students don't do that. It's kind of an, oh, well, I guess I wasn't meant to understand this. They just go ahead and fail. So Professor John, appears to understand that the academic difficulties of his students are not just about not knowing how to study. Their difficulties are a reflection of a broken educational system that disproportionately disadvantages poor and minority students. As the work of Gary Orfield and Patricia Gandara shows, up to 2/3 of Latino and Black students attend segregated or highly segregated schools. These schools, which are low-resourced and often have one counselor per 1,000 students, deprive them of all kinds of opportunities. They do not teach them the cultural practices that help more advantaged students to exercise agency on their own behalf. Help seeking, as John points out, is a learned cultural practice that is more likely to be exercised by those who feel a right to education. So earlier I showed the Puente syllabus, and you may have noticed that the instructor had thought of putting into her syllabus all kinds of things to encourage students to seek help. Based on our center's work with almost 100 college campuses across several states, I can say with considerable confidence that Professor John's interpretation of the challenges he faces as an instructor represents the norm. When students do not do well, we tend to attribute their performance to having attended bad schools. It is the fault of the high schools for not preparing them for college, and to some extent that is of course true. Or as Professor John said, they have bad habits, or they don't seek help. In the colleges that I work with, a favorite line is, we have wonderful resources, but they just don't use them. And I see some nodding heads, so I guess you've heard this too. I also hear worse things, such as, it has to do with genetics. Yes, I actually heard that. Asian students are more predisposed to doing well than Latinos or Blacks. Asian students are more predisposed to transferring to Berkeley, whereas Latino students are more predisposed to staying close to home. These are the things that I have heard. We have learned to view inequalities in educational outcomes as a matter of student deficiencies, not as a matter of practices that are failing to produce as much success for Latino and Black students as they do for whites, and in many cases, Asian students as well. Practice theorists suggest that over time and through a variety of experiences, practitioners develop implicit theories about the individuals they serve, about their own practices and their own roles. Analysis of practitioners' talk, which is some of the research that we do, consistently show that the prevailing funds of knowledge informing Professor John's ideas, that their interpretations of student outcomes reflect widely accepted beliefs about student success, mostly derived from psychological theories of motivation, self-efficacy, and self-regulation, as well as sociological theories of cultural integration. Accordingly, practitioners have learned to associate academic success with individual characteristics and attributes that signify the motivated, self-regulating, academically and socially engaged archetype college student. John's way of viewing the problem of his Mexican-American students reflect the knowledge, values, and beliefs that comprise academic and disciplinary culture. John's knowledge, as well as what he has learned to expect based on his own experiences as a college student, as a son of highly educated parents, and as a white male with credentials from highly selective research universities, influences how he frames the problem and what he should do. The culture of science, the culture of the department, and his own accumulated knowledge, what Don Polkinghorne describes as existing in the background, below consciousness, are not likely to help Professor John question himself about what he could do differently. As I said earlier, the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu suggests that we academics resist being self-reflective about our professional practices. Bourdieu uses the term resistance, but in our work, we find that it is more productive to view the problem as having to do with lack of knowledge. Professor John's inability to reflect on the situation of his Mexican-American students from the standpoint of racial equity and the role that he can play to assist them is a problem of knowledge and academic socialization. As academics, we have not been socialized to doubt our practices and interrogate them. Professor John did not say to me, for instance, I've been asking myself, why is it that none of my undergraduate lab assistants are Latinos? Or, I've noticed that Latino students rarely seek me out, and it's bothering me. Or, I looked over the last 3 years of grades for my genetics class, and I noticed that Latino students rarely earned an A. Why would that be? He did not ask any of these questions. I think that the reason Professor John does not reflect on his practices, specifically in relation to Latinos, is because he's not in a situation that makes such questions obvious and necessary. I don't think those things are talked about in departmental meetings. I don't think it's an issue of resistance. I think it's an issue of opportunity to learn and change. In the context of the work we do at the Center for Urban Education, we start from the premise that Professor John is not a prisoner of his culturally acquired knowledge, and that his practices and beliefs can be remediated. We believe that Professor John wants to do the good for all his students, but that to do the good, and by doing the good, I mean focusing on equity as an educational aim for Mexican-American students in his case, he needs to develop specialized knowledge and expertise to recognize the racialized nature of the collegiate experience for his students, and he has to adjust his practices accordingly. Telling students that what they're doing is wrong is not a practice that supports the aims of equity. We believe that Professor John, though, can become equity-minded. We also believe that in order for practitioners like Professor John to become equity-minded, traditional third-person research methods are not appropriate. Let me explain why by quickly describing the difference between third, second, and first-person research. As I mentioned, John was part of a study funded by the National Science Foundation. And that kind of work that I did, my interviewing John and many other faculty members, represents what's called third-person researcher because it's the outsider, me as a researcher, interviewing the insider. In the tradition of third-person research, we could be quantitative or qualitative, as shown here. The products are articles published in peer-reviewed journals, books, and reports, all of which we have done as part of the National Science Foundation project. But in most instances, the products of third-person research are written for an audience of our own peers. It is highly unlikely that Professor John would read the work because it's published in journals that are not relevant to his discipline. And even if he were to read one of our reports from this project where we actually describe how to be an institutional agent for students, it may not be sufficient to just read the report as a catalyst for self-change. I don't say this because I am cynical or pessimistic. I say it because the purpose of third-person research is to contribute new knowledge and advance new theories. And even though recommendations may be made, they're usually at a general level. Just as policies are not self-implementable, the solutions that research studies may recommend are also not self-implementable. To bring about the change in Professor John, we need tools, as well as structures and scaffolding. To support Professor John in developing new knowledge and practices that are responsive to the needs of his Mexican-American students, my colleagues and I have turned to the research methods described here by Kimmis and McTaggart as second and first person research, and which we at the Center for Urban Education have translated into action research and action inquiry. As action researchers, me and my colleagues, we engage in what's called second person research by creating tools that are responsive to the immediate situation of practitioners. The purpose of these tools is to engage practitioners like Professor John in action inquiry, or what is called first-person research. First-person research means that the practitioner, rather than the outsider researcher, carries out an investigation of everyday practices as if he or she was seeing them from a distance for the first time, and to understand how they might be experienced by minoritized students. I said earlier that in all likelihood, third-person research would not be a catalyst that prompts change among practitioners. You know, we as academics always think that when we write articles, so in my case, the Journal for Higher Education, the Review of Higher Education, we actually, are optimistic and think that others, will go and read and they will see our wisdom and go and change their practices, but it doesn't work that way. Instead, first-person research, or what we call action inquiry, is the preferred method to bring about equity-mindedness, because through inquiry, practitioners come to understand how their practices work, for whom do they work, and who do they disadvantage. So, in the tradition of practice theorists and pragmatists, we organize practitioners like John into a community of inquiry. The principles that drive our methods can be summarized as follows, and I'm not going to go into them because I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk. The framework we have created for our inquiry tools is the equity scorecard, and if you want to, you can ask me during the question and answer why we call it the equity scorecard. The equity scorecard encompasses many tools to carry out each of its 5 phases. The essential features of the equity scorecard tools are as follows. One is the use of microdata to understand inequality concretely. And in the tradition of John Dewey's pragmatism, to learn to frame inequality as a problematic or indeterminate situation that demands inquiry. And I'm going to show you now some examples of what I mean by microdata. So, and I'm using here data from community colleges, and this is one college, and I don't know if you know that in community colleges, students are often placed in non-credit remedial education courses. And institutional researchers might present data like, in data tables, reams and reams. So what we have done is think about ways of making the message more clear. So what you see here, 33 Latinos in the lowest level math course. And then we show how many of those went to the next math course. And you can see we lost more than half. And then how many got to the course that's right before the last course in the sequence, and you can see we lose more, and then even more, and then you finally get to the transfer eligible math, and we started out with 33, and there's 1 left. And this is actual data from one of our colleges, but when they see in data tables, they may not realize the magnitude of the problem. It may not be enough to have them want to say, we need to do something about it. Here's another example of microdata. What you can see here is this is another college. So what it shows is Math 105 also, and it shows that there were 10 sections of it, but that across the sections, there was a great variety of pass rates, from 71% for the highest to 0% for the lowest. And so the purpose of showing this data is for practitioners in math to begin to question why is that, right? Okay, the second element of our work is that we use, once they see data like this, we use inquiry protocols to understand the practices that are enacted in the places where practitioners and students come together, such as in the classroom, in office hours, in the science lab, in centers that provide academic student support services, such as a tutoring center. So what I'm showing here, and I'm going to talk about him, this is the chair of the community math at the Community College of Aurora. But one of the practices that we use is what I showed earlier, the syllabi. Remember I showed the two syllabi, and that comes from one of the activities that we do. We have faculty together look at their syllabi using a protocol that enables them to evaluate it from an equity and student-centered perspective. And these are the kinds of tools that we have created to enable those types of investigations. So then you see things like this. So this is from a math syllabus where again, a remedial math course in a community college where the faculty member put in his syllabus this formula for students to figure out how they could figure out their final grade. Now, mind you, these are students who are in a remedial math course. They see this on the first day of class. You can imagine what kinds of emotions it will elicit. So my students put that there. So the third element is the use of inquiry and language to model equity-mindedness. Inquiry is a means of bringing to the open practitioners' sense-making about inequalities, increasing awareness of implicit bias, stereotypes, and deficit perspectives. One of the things that we have found in our work is because we're working inside colleges with these teams of practitioners, their talk is impromptu, it's unrehearsed talk. So they talk in ways about this data and the reasons for the data that I showed you in ways that they may not talk about in a more formal setting. So what our work has elicited is a lot of their implicit biases and stereotypes. Now, this is the chair of the math department at the Community College of Aurora. And what I didn't say is that our center has human resources. We provide our campuses with a project specialist that is kind of like a coach for the teams. And Debbie Hanson, the coach for this team, Community College of Aurora, was speaking with James Gray. I can use his name because he's now part of our center as well. And said to him, well, how do you do hiring? And he said, I never thought about it. And then he thought about it. And what he said was that when that question was asked, he realized that in the 10 years that he had been the chair of the math department at the Community College of Aurora, as you can see, he had never hired an African-American instructor, either as an adjunct or as a full-time instructor. And in thinking about that, he realized that the methods that he used for hiring, which were calling his colleagues at the other community colleges in Colorado, it was an insurance to not hire any African Americans because there weren't any in the other colleges either. And so what he realized in reflecting about it was that he was looking for math instructors that were just like him. And the moment that he realized that, he changed. He changed the hiring practices in every possible way. So for instance, he changed the number of people that they talked to in the pre-interview. He changed the number of people that they brought on to campus. But the biggest change was, I mentioned the syllabus activity. He had the candidates present, how would they present the syllabus on the first day of class in order to be able to see which candidates would identify with students. Well, the makeup of the Community College of Aurora Math Department has changed dramatically. And the other thing that James did, I showed you the microdata. He disaggregated every class in math by race and ethnicity, met with each faculty member to show them the data, not in a punitive way, but to talk about what could be done differently. And the faculty at first may have pushed back, But, you know, I said faculty want to do the good. At least that's the premise that we start from. And so they wanted to do something about it. And one of the things that they did was they set equity goals for math by race and ethnicity. And each faculty member that teaches math, they know, in my class, I have this many African American students and I have this many Latinos. And of these, this many need to be successful in order for us to meet our equity goals. Now, James knew that people would be skeptical and that they would say, well, you're just dumbing down the class. And so you're just passing the students. So what he does is he shows the students' performance in the next level math course. I have to say that much to our surprise, the math outcomes have skyrocketed in this college for Latinos and African Americans. Now, I am not so naive to say that it's all because of the equity scorecard. I realize that we're not controlling for students, you know, academic background, but something is happening that is engaging the math faculty in ways that they have not been engaged before. Additionally, what's interesting about what has happened here is that James, he had never heard of equity. He had never thought about race. In fact, he now speaks openly about how he grew up in a fairly racist home. But he grabbed on to our work. And in part, I think, it was because it was empowering to him. And what he will say is that this was one of the best professional development activities for him, in that he has become more of an instructional leader rather than a bureaucrat, you know, scheduling courses. So let me go on quickly here. I'm going to skip some things. And so I was going to talk a little bit about what we have learned. So one of the things that we have, so I use the term equity-mindedness. This is what it means to be equity-minded. It means to be race and color conscious. It means that you need to be able to understand systemic and structural racism. And this is probably the most challenging aspect of our work, in that we have been really good at developing data tools that work great, but we are still struggling with how to bring about conceptual cognitive shifts in people's thinking. You know, like I talked to you about Professor John. We have not worked with Professor John, but you know, I don't know how successful we would be in bringing about equity-mindedness, at least in the way that we did for James Gray. The other aspect of our work that is challenging is that one can fall into the trap of treating the faculty in the same way that sometimes they treat students. One can begin to treat the faculty, like Professor John, as deficient, right? And blaming him for not being a more caring instructor. So that's something that we have to keep reminding ourselves, that our job is not to be there to tell them how to change, but that we need to be able to create really good tools that will bring about self-change. So just as we want Professor John to reflect on why he has no Latino lab assistants, we need to reflect at our center why our tools may not be working in the way that we would like them to. The last thing that I wanted, I was going to tell you, the syllabus that I showed you, the rules-minded, that came from a meeting last week that I was at, and I didn't behave well. My shock at seeing that syllabus and those rules came across. And I went back to my office and I realized that that was a mistake because the faculty member realized it. I'm going to have lunch with her tomorrow, and we're going to talk about it. She is convinced that this is what works, to have rules for the students. And I'm going to have to figure out how to persuade her that the Puente syllabus is the way to go, that her syllabus, perhaps in unintended ways, is showing contempt for students. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is that some of you may be thinking is, well, is this research? So, research that doesn't conform to the methods of third-person research is still viewed with suspicion. Moreover, research that has an explicit agenda around race and racism is vulnerable to the critique of activism, disguised in the trappings of research. There's a strong preference in the research community and also among some funders for research that mimics the scientific method, that is predictive, that is generalizable, that produces scalable best practices. It is really hard to communicate evidence of the kind that I have communicated to you, of these kinds of changes. I mean, it's hard to say, well, at the Community College of Aurora, the chair of the math department changed his hiring practices. You know, when you put that next to big reports about, for instance, the Tennessee Community College's acceleration of remedial education. So it's really hard for us to think about ways to communicating our impact against big data studies. Throughout the years of doing this work, we have been careful, therefore, to maintain a conventional research agenda to document the outcomes of action inquiry. We publish articles in peer-reviewed journals, and we publish books. Our PhD students have produced more than 20 dissertations on various aspects of this work. We have also received funding from the Spencer Foundation to study the impact of the equity scorecard in the Pennsylvania State College system. Most recently, the National Science Foundation, on hearing about the Community College of Aurora work, funded us to hold a conference with math faculty in Colorado's community colleges to share with them the results of that work. The National Academy of Education has invited us to share the metrics we use to assess equity, both in outcomes and in process. So slowly we're noticing that there is increasing acceptance for this kind of research. So by way of conclusion, I want to return to the public university and the social good. I have described how I and my colleagues created a structure to pursue equity, a social good that is just as essential today as it was in 1964. I have described the research methods that provide practitioners with the tools, and by tools I mean not only protocols, data templates, but also a new language to talk about equity and race, new concepts to differentiate between equity, equality, and diversity. And most valuable of all, we provide the human resources that I mentioned to you, our project specialists. We view higher education institutions as human organizations. Accordingly, we have invested our efforts on the potential and possibility of every practitioner to become, like James Gray at the Community College of Aurora, a first-generation equity practitioner. He uses that term, first-generation equity practitioner, to signal that it's not just about first-generation students, but also first-generation equity practitioners. Our methods and approach are highly contextualized. Some aspects of it are standard, but implementation is constantly being shaped and reshaped by local needs, expertise, leadership, resources, and external demands. Our approach has shown to be successful in changing minds and changing practices. It has shown to be successful in spurring innovation and in developing academic leadership. But in this particular moment in our society and in higher education, our approach may appear like an anachronism. We live in an era of bigness, big data, big college attainment goals, you know, the Lumina Foundation, 60% college-educated adults by 2025, predictive analytics to steer students into the majors that, based on the mixology of an array of variables, magically determine the majors students should pursue and increase their chances of success. We live in an era where large foundations are pushing streamlining strategies like restricted pathways as solutions to low performance in community colleges, confident that low rates of graduation are caused by too many curricular choices for community college students. These big solutions may turn out to be the 21st century version of Frederick Taylor's scientific management. Their key principles are restricted pathways, predictive analytics, increased outputs, more effective degree attainment. These techno-rational solutions will not intrude into the academic worlds of UC Davis or USC. They're primarily aimed at managing, or maybe one might say disciplining, the open access, high minority public institutions. There's also an increasing effort to steer students into short-term certificate programs that contribute to workforce development. The techno-rational culture that is creeping into institutions that serve a growing non-white public are a threat to the social good, which I have defined as equity. They are a threat because even though they may cause disproportionate negative impact on Blacks, Latinos, and other marginalized groups, they are still presented as colorblind, objective interventions to serve all students, and all in capitals. I see the research methods I have described and the equity agenda that drives them as the antitheses to technocratic solutions that treat the university as a machine that takes inputs, puts them on the pathway that has been chosen for them by a computer, and spits them out into the workforce. As the antithesis to the techno-rational worldview, our research methods are designed to develop Professor John and his colleagues into best practitioners who are equity-minded instead of best practices. We aim to put into action the aspirations of the university to be just, to be emancipatory, and to be anti-racist. Thank you.
And we have time for questions and answers, about 15 minutes or so. I think I would like to ask the first question, actually. In your list of institutions. Yes. Okay. Yes, okay. For prostate. So we have about 15 minutes for the question and answer period. And I'd like to ask the first question. The list of institutions that you had there didn't include a lot of research universities. So could you talk about the specific issues that maybe research universities face? Does that change the situation from your perspective?
We haven't worked with research universities because none have come and asked us to work with them. That's one thing. But when we write our proposals so sometimes increasingly institutions are coming to us and actually contracting us. But we also do funded research, and the foundations are much more interested in working with open access institutions, and that's why so much of our work is in community colleges. At the University of Wisconsin, we worked with all of the campuses except Madison. Madison felt that they were past what we did, but recent events have shown otherwise. We worked with Purdue University as well, and that was a total failure. I think that research universities may feel that, that this is not, that they have already, addressed these issues. And I'm not sure how it would work using our approach, a community of inquiry of faculty members in a research university. So we would probably, might need to, would have to adjust it. But that's, yeah.
But mostly you didn't get a lot of invitations.
No.
Okay, I'm sure there will be more questions.
Thank you. That was a fabulous talk, and I hope that you'll give Francis your complete text, since you had to cut some bits of it so it can go up online. There should be many more people from this research university, starting with our deans here, to listen to it, because I think you had, I just, as a former chair, can think about syllabi right now as a, it would be a brilliant way of starting a discussion. It should happen at department meetings. My question really goes to, I think, the aspirations or the social justice ambitions of your project, broadly construed. Pierre Bourdieu, whom you mentioned, and also a colleague of mine named Evan Watkins, who wrote a book about work time discipline in English departments in the 70s, a Marxist study, argued that the institutions of higher learning in our country are not aiming at the social good, much less equity, but they are in fact machines for creating distinction that allows sorting to occur in the workforce in the most efficient possible way, and that the research universities are the most egregious in this way. And it seems to me that just in practical terms, that the question of grading would be an issue in this, because after 40 years of teaching at various kinds of institutions, I've come to feel that my responsibility to sort the students into A, B, C, D failing is directly opposed to my desire, which is somewhat foiled by having large classes, but my desire is to start where they are and to encourage them and to give them, it's sort of like I would like to be their kindergarten teacher and give them marks for doing well, as far as I can judge it. And that's certainly to change the syllabus, not to have, those rules are there in order to make it easy if the student breaks the rule to cut points. They're efficient that way. So how do you see this work that you're doing with Professor, well, you could do with Professor John or with someone like me, affecting how we can go against the institutional pressure to sort students by their performance, assuming that they all start at the same place, which obviously they don't.
Right. We haven't dealt with grading. What we have done is, what color is an A? What we have tried to get our campuses to see that that the students who earn the A's, even in Hispanic serving institutions, you see the stratification right there. I think that the way that we do it, so there was a faculty member in the sciences in another college who said in the meeting that about grading on the curve. Is it on the curve, right? And I was surprised that that still exists. And so I would say that that would be an area that we would address in our work, like why do you need to do that? And who is getting disadvantaged by doing that kind of grading? But to answer your question, our work is really pragmatic and practical. So we want the students to be able to get the credentials to go on to graduate school. We want them to get the credentials to transfer, not just to the Cal States, and not anything against the Cal States, but we don't have enough students transferring to the UC. Well, now you're accepting all of those out-of-state students. So that's what we want. So if grading is important to that, what we will work with is how to help faculty members be at least fair graders, rather than graders that are influenced by implicit biases, as we know they are. I mean, we know that there's bias towards males in grading, who's doing well, and the same thing with minority students, or, I mean, we all do it. We want to go to the student who looks like they're listening to us, they're engaged, they think that we're important. And we kind of avoid the students who seem to be, indifferent or maybe feigning indifference. So that's why Professor John may not have any Latino students in his lab. And what I didn't show in my presentation is I didn't show the faculty members at that university who were themselves first-generation faculty members and were doing all kinds of things to develop that scientific identity on Latino students who maybe were average.
How do you, could you maybe talk a little bit more about your comment about African Americans and Latinos specifically, as opposed to the generalized concept of diversity? Because I think even given events on the campus here, events that have been held, the White House Summit on African American Success, there was an event last week on women leadership in academia. I think there might be, maybe it's a legal basis, and maybe the provost could weigh in on this, but it seems like if you set up sort of categories of groups A and B are more institutionally discriminated against than groups C, D, and E, it sounds like you potentially set up a whole nother set of problems.
Okay, the reason why we focus on race is because the disadvantages that are accumulated as a result of being Black or being Latino or being Native American are very different from the disadvantages that you accumulate from being a woman or from being poor. So, for instance, you don't necessarily see the student who is poor as poor if that student is white. But you do see race, and the reason why I use color is because when we're making a judgment on it, it's based on color. Because, I mean, race is a socially constructed category. So, and the reason why for the African Americans is that we have to look at history. We have to look at Jim Crow, and we have to look at enslavement. And even though those things may not exist, today, they are still the accumulation of inequality. So I think that when we confound race with gender, with socioeconomic status, we're evading the question of racial equity. And I think that people feel more comfortable talking about diversity than having to engage in race talk. I mean, there is an incredible fear to talk about race. We just did a webinar with a group of institutions, and they said, the poll was like over 50% that talking about race is too risky, because in higher education, we want to be collegial. We are kind of conflict adverse. So if we talk about race, it might cause conflicts, as you said. You may be creating a whole set of other problems. I think that we also need to talk about white fragility. I mean, I think, a lot of times white people do not want to engage in race talk because they're afraid that they will be accused of being racist, that they're being made feel guilty. The notion that whiteness is a property that accrues privileges can be something difficult to accept. So, all of those things. But across our nation, the biggest inequalities right now are African Americans in particular, and Latinos. And Latinos, also come from a history of colonization. annexation of lands, the prohibition of speaking in Spanish, for instance. So for all of those reasons. And finally, I think that we're all products of our own backgrounds, right? So I came of age in the 1960s. So for me, equity is much more comfortable than diversity.
To a requirement that you have a whole deeper level of conversation at universities to get this point across?
Yeah, that's why we work long term. We don't do just workshops. When we work with an institute, so Community College of Aurora, which I featured, but all of the other ones too, we work with them for at least 1 year, if not longer. And it's a very structured, assisted process of inquiry. You know, obviously faculty members are not anthropologists, but in a way, that's what we're teaching them to do. We teach them how to go and sit in the math lab for a couple of hours and observe what's going on so that they can notice who gets help, who is doing the helping, how they are greeted. I mean, that kind of micro-level cultural audit.
Yes, first of all, great talk, Dr. Bensimon. My name is Pablo, and I'm a graduate student here at UC Davis, but I'm also a practitioner. I work at another UC campus in Santa Cruz. I was wondering, you talked about the story of Professor John, and as you work with evidence teams and campus teams that look at the equity scorecard data, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about administrators of color, faculty of color who approach this work, who, like myself, are often the ones raising our hands, bringing up issues around race. Oftentimes we're in settings where race is muted, and that tension is very strong. So I'm wondering from the other perspective, from those that have engaged in the equity scorecard have been in situations where they're seen as the angry minority, bringing up these issues that nobody wants to talk about. How have those faculty and administrators embraced, or what have you seen, any patterns or trends around how they have intersected with this process? Because it can be very risky. It can be risky also to not say anything.
Right.
And have a strong sense of ownership over that work. So I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about what you've seen from that side of the...
So remember, I said that this work is highly contextualized. So in some teams where we have had members of color, they feel that this is very empowering because suddenly it's out in the open and they're part of it. In other cases, they don't want any part of it because of the history of the institution. Also, what I didn't say is that when we form the teams, we're very careful that the people in the teams, they have to have power. In other words, because if we put people that don't have some kind of power, they can be easily, over-talked, talked over. And so we actually have a protocol for how we form the team. And there are a whole set of criteria so that it's not just the diversity people that are put on the team. But I would say to you that it is important for us to have people of color in the teams because often equity-mindedness comes more naturally to them. So they can raise questions in the team discussions that might not get otherwise addressed. But we don't want them to be the only voice and be pigeonholed into that role. But it really does vary. And we are getting to be more careful about institutional readiness to engage in this work. So I went to the Coast Guard Academy. They're interested in using the equity scorecard. And I don't think that they're ready for it. So we offered an intermediate step.
Thank you. My name is Griselda. I really appreciate you helping to help faculty reframe that sometimes it's restructuring of the curriculum that will bring us the greatest result. I'm wondering if you've done any work with some community colleges that are experimenting. I've seen some of the faculty at Los Medanos Community College talk about how they have helped with the transfer graduation of underrepresented students by restructuring the remedial courses, because they've been designed so there's so many rights of omission, so many barriers that they frustrate the students in being able to get through them to get to the credit bearing courses, and this great discouragement. You know, who wants to go to community college for 6 years before you could transfer? But when they've restructured the curriculum one level below the credit bearing courses and changed the modality of teaching, all of a sudden the students can achieve at that level and transfer. I don't know if you've worked with some of them or if that's included.
We worked with Los Medanos a few years ago, but so what I would say about I think that we need to, remedial education in a community college is a crime, essentially. It's terrible. And we need to do something about it. But doing a structural change is not enough, because that teacher that had that rules-minded syllabus will still be part of the instruction, right? So my biggest concern about what's going on in higher education with all of these reforms is that the emphasis is on structural reform and not on reforming, practices and practitioners. And we will just then continue reproducing the same thing, except that maybe will be more accelerated. The other thing I would say is that, always ask for the data. People always talk in generalities, and they say they're more transferring. So the question is more who, right? And it's important to do that. A lot of the acceleration work is good, but it's not equity focused.
For one more question. Okay.
Oh, well, no one asked me why we called it an equity scorecard. So I'll tell you why. So it was very opportunistic, because at the time that we started this work, there was, a very robust accountability agenda in public higher education. Everybody was into accountability and dashboards, right? The yellow light, the red light, the green light. So we called it an equity scorecard, because we figured it would appeal to institutional leaders as well as to foundations. And we were right. Calling it a scorecard makes it much better than calling it, I don't know, something else that we didn't call it. But that it was opportunistic. Even as much as I hated things like scorecards or total quality management.
This has been a fabulous thing. It seems to me that research universities need this kind of work as much or more than the others. This should be next step for our campus, perhaps. So thank you very much.
Thank you.